We are in the 1840s right now, specifically 1843. The Millerites are looking forward to the coming of their Savior and friend, Jesus Christ. They're talking to their friends, to their neighbors, and they try to convince them to get ready for Jesus to come. Now, for the Millerites, this is not an event that they are dreading, that they are afraid of. They are looking forward to the coming of their friend, of Jesus. They've put all their hopes, all their money and time into this. They go to their fellow church members, to their parishioners, to their fellow pastors, and they talk to them and they try to wake them up that Jesus is coming soon. But eventually, other church leaders are getting uneasy. And they feel like that there's too much interruption in the church services. And so they tell these Millerites to become quiet, to not talk about their belief in the second coming of Christ. And so eventually, they begin to disfellowship church members that are Millerites, that believe in the second coming of Christ. Some pastors are fired. Other pastors are moved to smaller districts where they have not such a big influence. And so the Millerites eventually are leaving the churches and saying that these churches have rejected the belief in the second coming of their Lord and Savior. And so they say these churches have become Babylon. From this point onward, those Millerites associate organization, church structure with Babylon. And so this continues to be the case for the next couple of years. Now they're looking forward that Christ comes back on October 22, 1844. Of course, those of you who know more about Adventist history, you know that's simplified, it's more complex, but I simplified for the sake of time. So they're looking forward for Christ to come in October, but their hopes don't materialize. Christ doesn't show up. And so afterwards, they're trying to find a solution. And they look into different things and they wonder, so what happened? And the Millerite movement disintegrates and falls apart. And so this is what these early Adventists refer to as the scattering time. They disintegrate, they fall apart into different groups. And so this continues until 1846. By that time now, these people that become the nucleus for what is later known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church, so our church, they discovered the seventh-day Sabbath in Scripture. They studied Scripture also, and they discovered that there's a heavenly sanctuary. They discovered that actually there was not just the first angel's message to become ready for the judgment and for Christ's coming, and that there was a second angel's message to come out of the churches, but there was actually a third angel's message. And the third angel's message talked about a group of people that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. And they said, wow, this is amazing. We just discovered the Sabbath, which is part of the commandments, something that we didn't know before. And so they found a prophetic identity in Scripture. As they continue to study, they find a message where the Sabbath and the sanctuary and the third angel's message, the second coming, and eventually the sealing in Revelation 13 and Revelation 7 are integrated so that they become an integrated message. Eventually, they realize the Sabbath message, this integrated Sabbath message, not just the belief that this is the right day, but that it has an end-time significance. It pushes them to evangelize this message more broadly and to share it with the world. Now, around this time, Ellen White says, we're no longer in the scattering time. We're in the gathering time. And I would add, today we are still in the gathering time. So around this time, in 1848, Ellen White has a vision that we refer to as the streams of light vision, where she goes to her husband and says, I was shown that you should start a paper. It would be very small in the beginning, but eventually it would go all around the world, and it would be streams of light that go all around the world. Now, at that time, Millerites, or actually Sabbatarian Adventists, were counted in the hundreds, not in the millions. And those hundreds were confined to the northeast of the United States. Nobody at that time was really thinking about Texas. But when Ellen White said that she saw that streams of light would be going out from this paper and go all around the world, you could say that was pretty ambitious. But today we can say, looking back, this is what happened. But we shouldn't sit down and be content and say, we are done with our work. Yeah? So already in 1850 then, Ellen White and also James White, her husband, they began to emphasize a principle that they called gospel order. Now, what is gospel order? They said this is a principle that we see reflected in the New Testament, that we see also reflected in all passages that somehow talk about heaven. Somehow there is, whatever God does, there's order to it. A principle of unity and of organization. And so they were asking church members to apply this principle of gospel order in their churches. Now, we did really have lots of churches. There were groups of believers that met in different places. And so initially, the only organizational element that they had was a periodical, where people sent letters and where they said what happened in their place when a pastor came along, and this periodical was a platform to communicate. Eventually, then, we realized, since everybody from these different Adventist groups, some were keeping Sunday, others were keeping the Sabbath, some thought that Christ had already come back spiritually, and we were in the millennium. Now, as a side note, when some people thought that, James White was traveling in the winter through the snow, and he said, "It is weird. I'm traveling here through 3 feet, right? 3 feet of snow. It doesn't really feel like the heavenly Jerusalem." But these different people were just going across the different boundaries of the different churches, of these different groups. And so somebody came and said, "Hi, I'm an Adventist." And he began to tell stories or tell doctrines where then people in a certain place said, "But that's not what we believe." But since there were no church boundaries, everybody was just going back and forth between the different groups. And so eventually they said, we need somehow ministers and certify who belongs to us and who doesn't belong to us, kind of creating boundaries. Yeah? So this continued for the rest of the 1850s. And when Adventists get into the 1860s, they eventually realized something needs to be done. There was no church organization, and that created problems. You could say practical problems. There were cases where a church member had given, for example, a property, and then everybody, all the believers, threw together some money, and then they built a church building on this property. But the question is, who was the owner of the property? It was an individual. And so in one case, for example, this individual defected from the faith. He said, "No, the building is mine because it's my property." And so he created a vinegar factory out of this church building. Fortunately, that didn't happen in our group. That was in a different Millerite group. Yeah? But we had also similar stories. Some church buildings were turned into tobacco factories. As I said, in another case, it was like a vinegar factory. Now, James White said, the problem is the printing press, where we publish the Review and Herald, where we publish books, belongs to me personally. If something happens to me and I die, the printing press is lost because my children are underage, they can't own it, my wife can't own it, so basically somebody is put in to kind of regulate the management of this thing, and it would be lost to the church. Somehow there needs to be an organization that can hold this property. And so, of course, they came together with thinking about a name. Because if you create a society or association, you need some name. And so they were discussing it, debating it, and eventually somebody suggested the name Seventh-day Adventists. But the wording that he chose was not something that people liked. He said that we should, I don't know what wording that he used. It was something like we should call ourselves or give us the name Seventh-day Adventists, and they said that sounds too much like Babylon. So the resolution was withdrawn, and eventually then Moses Hall said, why don't we just say we call ourselves Seventh-day Adventists? They liked that, and that was chosen, so they found the name for the church. Interestingly, just a couple of days before that meeting, Ellen White gave birth to her fourth son, and they didn't have a name for the child. So they called him the little nameless one. For the next 2 months, they didn't have a name for the child, but fortunately, they had found a name for the church. So many Adventists had difficulties to found an organization because in their minds, organization was still connected to Babylon. Church structure was still connected to Babylon because of the experience that they had. And so Ellen White addressed them and said, you're so afraid that by creating some church structure, you will create Babylon. However, by not creating any organization, you remain in a state of confusion, in chaos, and you're complete Babylon. So in that sense, she encouraged them to organize the church. Now, she did not provide any advice what structure to use, but eventually they used the structure that they found in the Methodist Church, for example, or also in some other churches. So they created conferences in 1861, and the following years, 1863, the General Conference. And when they established this organization, the purpose was to further the mission of the church, to make it possible to really orchestrate that enough ministers are placed in one place and also in another place, and to help them to kind of cover the different areas. As the church continued on, and we get into the 1890s, we realized more and more that the church was extremely centralized. Only a few people were responsible for all kinds of positions, for all kinds of ministries in the church. There was basically just a conference office, the General Conference. We had no departments at the time. That may be a surprise to some of you, but basically we had only associations and societies that were disconnected from the church structure, and they were only connected because the president, let's say, of the GC was also the president of the Sabbath School Association. And so in different places in the world, churches realized somehow this is not efficient. We sometimes write a letter and we wait for months to receive an answer. And then eventually we get the answer, and the answer is no. And so, for example, in South Africa, they said, we would like to dissolve these associations and societies and create departments. And so that's what they did. But that was unique to South Africa. Something similar happened in Australia, where they said, we would like to have a union between the conferences and the General Conference. They asked the GC, they waited for an answer, didn't hear back from them for months. So they did it. And then the GC said, no, you're not supposed to do it. But they had already done it. And so the leader from the work in Australia eventually, in 1901, became the General Conference president. And so they said, actually, it worked quite well in Australia, so we recommend to the world field to introduce unions basically in every area. And then they also recommended to dissolve the associations and societies and integrate those as departments of the church. And so that's why we have unions today, but there were no divisions yet. As we get into the 1910s, eventually, then divisions were created. And so I'm just describing here like the creation of different levels because the church realized that we had certain issues when it comes to efficiency. It became more and more difficult to somehow handle this body. And on the other hand, also because power was kind of connected and centered in the hands of very few people. Now, this is a little bit the history of the church and the way how we got here. I think there's more to say about this, but we see that in general the church was trying to navigate, on one hand, through the extreme of like concentration of power in the hands of very few people, like centralization of power, and on the other hand, too much independence. On one hand, this abuse of power that could be the result if one person has too much power in his own hands, and on the other hand, that actually the gospel work is no longer advanced because everybody just does what he thinks is right in his own mind. So in that sense, we see how the church and the organization of the church developed, and it developed because of the needs that were there in the field. So I think when we look at Ellen White's writings, we see that she often talked about principles, but she seldom told people how to apply them. I think today we live in a time where we also realize that we have difficulties in various areas. On one hand, centralization of power, on the other hand, independence, inefficiency. And I think it will be necessary to maybe go back to Ellen White's writings and see what principles does she talk about, and how would it be possible to apply those to our current situation, to help the church to steer away, you could say, from these or through these extremes of too much independence, centralization, and inefficiency, and help the church to really advance the proclamation of the gospel in this world.
Ecclesiology quiz. Can you spell ecclesiology? Let's leave that one behind. Let me ask you an ecclesiology question. Is the General Conference president the boss of the union president? How many would say yes? How many don't want to answer this publicly? How many don't know? How many of you think that the General Conference president is not the boss of the union president? Oh, that's good. That's good. The answer is the General Conference president is not the boss of the union president. Next question is, who is the boss of the union president? What's that? That's one of the problems I have is I can't hear what you're saying, so I'm going to give you the answer. You probably have the answer right. The boss of the union president is the duly elected constituency. That is the delegates that constitute the constituency. So in other words, the union president has to look over the edge of the organization down to the people in order to get his marching orders. Are you aware of that? Now, this is Seventh-day Adventist organization, as it was designed in 1901. Let's see. Who is the boss of the General Conference president? Does he have a boss? Now, we have to be careful because we have a tendency to think in terms of corporate organization. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is not organized as a corporate organization. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't have corporations within it. I'm talking about structure, leadership structure. Who does the General Conference President answer to? GC Executive Committee. Okay? If there is a problem with the if there's a problem with the GC Executive Committee, who disciplines the Executive Committee? Actually, let me alter that question. If there's a problem with a member of the Executive Committee, who deals with the Executive Committee member? The Executive Committee. There is no higher authority outside of the General Conference in session. There's no higher authority than the GC Executive Committee. So can the President of the General Conference discipline an Executive Committee member? And the answer is no. Now, not everyone agrees with that. I have the privilege of knowing that I'm right. I think. Now, I believe that is actually policy, that the GC president does not have the authority to discipline a committee member. The committee must discipline the committee members. Does that make sense? Amen. Okay? What is the recommended ratio of lay people to clergy oriented or clergy people on the committee? What is the general counsel in terms of the balance between lay people and clergy on any executive committee? Do you have any idea? What would you get? Give me a percentage, a ratio. 50-50. Pretty simple. The recommended ratio between laity and clergy on executive committees are 50-50. That is specifically stated in regard to local conferences. Now, I want to spend just a moment reviewing this foundational issue. Who holds primary authority in the Seventh-day Adventist Church? The people. This is a unique organization, folks. The people hold primary authority. How do they exercise that authority? How do they exercise that authority? By electing delegates. Sending delegates to sending delegates to constituency sessions, General Conference session. Okay, it is through the delegate process that the body of believers exercises authority in the context of the governance of the church. Okay, let me ask you another one. Can leaders in the Seventh-day Adventist Church make strategic decisions? What's that? Yes? You must work at the conference office. No, just kidding. The answer is no. This is one of the unique aspects of our ecclesiology, that leaders do not make terminal decisions on strategic issues in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. All strategic decisions must be processed by executive committee. Now, understand, I'm talking about policy, not practice. There is a tendency, and my job is to talk about ecclesiology in the present. There is a tendency as we sit here tonight, there is a tendency for us to move toward a corporate model of organizational leadership, where leaders make decisions. The problem is our authority is based in the people. So how can leaders make final decisions if our constitutional organizational model is that authority rests with the people? Are you following me? Terminal authority in the Seventh-day Adventist Church belongs to the people. Okay, I'm going to ask you a really big question now. What is the church? Describe the church for me. Is the church the organization? No. Oh, now you got noisy. The church is not the organization. The church came together and created organization to assist in the mission of the church. Do you hear me? The organization is the creation of the church. So if the organization is the creation of the church, how could the organization ever become the church? Well, this is an important question, because there's evidence that we are forgetting what the church is in the context of the Seventh-day Adventist organization and church. If you ask most people, tell me about your church, what are they going to tell you? Almost always it will resort to a description of our organizational structure. The organization is simply at the disposal of the people. But there are times that it doesn't seem that way. Is it possible for the people to restructure the organization? Yeah, we have that authority. Here's the danger. And I'm not supposed to be talking about the past, but here's the danger. The danger is that we will allow our congregations, our people, to become ignorant of the unique structure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ignorance greases the pathway to autocracy. Ignorance greases the pathway to autocracy. How was the Roman Catholic system formed? The Roman Catholic system was formed on the back of people who were ignorant of the Word. Where was the Word at the time this all happened? It's chained to a pedestal. So if the people are ignorant, then the movement toward autocracy is much easier to accomplish. It actually happened more quickly than most of us realize. The early church transitioned into an autocracy where the people became subjects to the church. We as Seventh-day Adventists are not subjects to our leaders. We are the church. Are you hearing me? The people are the church. My counsel would be that at nominating committee time, at conference constituency time, at union constituency time, pick the brightest, the best, the most articulate people that you can find in your congregation. Do not allow it to deteriorate into who can go. You been there? Oh man, I went last time, let Harold go. If we do not maintain our system, we will lose it. You hear me? If we do not maintain our system, we will lose it. When we lose it, we will lose a sense of ownership. If the people cease to believe that the church is theirs, we will become ineffective and our model will become a joke. First Samuel. I turned 68 here recently. I'm trying not to be sensitive about that. But I got sensitive. I was reading in Samuel, chapter 8. And the elders of Israel come to Samuel at Ramah. And they look at him and they say, "You're old. Ouch. You are old. And your children don't obey." Ouch twice. I remember when I was reading, I looked over and my computer screen was off and it was dark, but I could see my reflection in there and my beard was all white. I said, ouch. And I thought about my precious children. They're not always obedient and they don't always walk in my ways. The elders of Israel said, "Give us a king. Give us a king who will judge us." Very politically correct request, since it was during the time of the kings that they make the request. The judges. They said, "Give us a king who will judge us." Samuel was hurt by that. He goes to the Lord. He lays it before God. God says to him, "Samuel, don't feel bad. It's not you that they rejected. They rejected me." He said, "But give them what they asked for." Now that's always a little bit scary. If God gives us what we have been asking for, and He's never indicated that it's His will, it's likely that He's simply giving it to us because He's tired of listening to us ask for it. Sometimes He gives us what we ask for simply to help us learn why we shouldn't have it. Give them a king, He says. A little later on, he says to Samuel, "Give him a king, but warn them of what will happen. He'll take your children, he's going to take your hay, he's going to take your grain, he's going to take your crops, he's going to take everything you've got. The day will come when you will bemoan the fact that you have a single king over you." Yet we as a church today are moving toward, more and more inclined toward, an authoritarian form of governance. We allow it to happen. 1901 General Conference session, and my time's about up, but the 1901 General Conference session created an organizational model that tried to guarantee that what we had been in the past would not be formed again. And what had been was we had become a kingly powered organization. Ellen White referred to it as the kingly power controversy. We don't hear much about it. As far back as 1873, and I know I'm going back into the past, and I'll have to apologize to Brother Kaiser here in a moment. George Butler, president of the General Conference, got into an argument with James White. James White was so affected by it, he had a stroke and fell on the floor, and they thought he was dead. So they put him in a wagon to send him home. They figured out he wasn't completely dead. They sent him home to Ellen. Ellen took him to another village and hid him. And she was quoted as saying, if we don't get you out of Battle Creek's going to kill you. So the next day, George Butler, who was General Conference president, goes looking for James. Can't find him. He does an investigation, figures out where he's at, goes to the village, goes in to visit him, and he apologizes for arguing with him. And then immediately starts the argument over. Now, this is a true story. This is a true story. I've got to cut this short. James didn't die, but George Butler responded in his reflection. He knew he had done wrong. He ended up writing an essay called Leadership. And in the essay called Leadership, he decided that James White should be the apostle to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And as apostle, James White should receive the authority to make decisions on all major decisions. And that whatever James White decided, no one could refute, no one could make it change. It was permanent if James said it. Ellen White reacted negatively. James reacted negatively, but it took him a little while. George Butler took it to the 1874 General Conference session, and that policy or that essay was voted into policy unanimously by God's people. Now, you may never have heard this story before, because we don't tell all the stories that happened in the early church, Adventist church. So what do you think Ellen's problem was with this model? Here's what she called it. It's papist. It's papist. So Brother Kaiser just told us that the baby needed a name. They give it a name within 10 years. Within 10 or 12 years, the church had gone from being anti-organization to deciding that James White should be the primary leader of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he could make all the decisions and never be questioned. Ellen White says we established a pope. That's how quick it can happen. And there are signs that we're moving in the wrong direction today, and I'm going to bring it to a close here. If we do not know our history, we are doomed to repeat it. Amen. One last reference to the Bible, and then I'm going to go. Gideon defeats the Midianites. The elders come to Gideon. Gideon, be our king, and your sons after you, and your sons' sons after them. What do you think Gideon's answer was? No. God is your ruler. Now listen to that carefully. This is profound, even though it's brief. No, God is your ruler. Did God ever intend that a king stand between God's people and him? Never. Never his plan. He gave it to them because they asked for it. Let's be careful. Let's remember that God still desires to be our king. We do not need a human being to be between us and God. Let's guard our freedom. Let's guard our rights. Let's guard our structure as it was voted by the pioneers, and stay true to the fact that God is our ruler. Thank you.
Good evening. At the beginning, I just want to mention how the book of Revelation is actually structured. One of the most obvious structure of the book is the threefold structure. Anyone who studied the book of Revelation will notice that the first and the obvious part of the book of Revelation is made from chapter 1 to chapter 3, what is known as the messages to the seven churches. The focus of this section of the book of Revelation is on the seven local congregations in Asia Minor in the first century at the time of John. And to them, the book of Revelation was originally sent. But in chapter 4:1, Jesus invites John to go there to heaven, promising to him that he will show him about what will happen in the future after those seven local congregations in Asia Minor. So as you can see in section B, from chapter 4, verse 1, all up to the end of chapter 11, we have the part of the book of Revelation that is known as the historical section. This section describes the history of the Christian church struggling in the world. And then going from chapter 11, verse 19, going all to chapter 22, verse 6. The focus is on the time of the end. And we call this section as eschatological. Please, you can see that before in the book of Revelation, we have a portrayal of any prophecy, of any future, whether through Christian history or at the time of the end. We have those first 3 chapters dealing with God's people. They are real Christians in real churches, and those churches were located in metropolitan, prestigious cities of the time. And so many times the readers of the book of Revelation overlook the facts that the book of Revelation, before telling the church about the message the church is about to proclaim to the world, God wants to say something very important to his own people. I apologize, my slides I lost there, and I have messed up with my slides, so I'm trying to do here the best what I have in front of me. I lost a number of slides here. The beginning of the book of Revelation begins with the description of John, who was on Patmos in the exile there. John was the pastor of those 7 congregations in Asia Minor. According to the history, John was arrested by Roman authorities, and he was sent to the island called Patmos. While he was there on Patmos, the churches where he was pastoring were left on their own. Those congregations that were located in the Roman province of Asia, they faced the challenges of the pagan environment. They were deprived of John's presence, and John was not there actually to help them. When we read the book of Revelation, those churches represented the entire Christian church from John's day until the time of the end. And the spiritual conditions of those 7 churches corresponded to the spiritual condition of Christianity in different periods on history. However, this first section of the book of Revelation actually is not on the churches. It's on Christ in their midst. And we read, John the Revelator is telling us, while he was on Patmos, he said, as he worried so much about the situation in those churches, what will happen to them, he said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, write what you see in the book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus and to Smyrna and to Pergamum and to Thyatira and to Sardis and to Philadelphia and to Laodicea. You can see those churches are mentioned here by name. And John says, when he heard that voice, I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. In the midst of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man who was clothed with a long robe. According to Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, the 7 lampstands, I apologize, my old slides here with so many typos, symbolized the 7 churches in Asia Minor. The lampstands were located in the holy place of the earthly sanctuary. And in the Israel temple, the lampstands provided the light, symbolizing God's plan for Israel, and to be his light-bearing witness to the world. And in Matthew chapter 14, Jesus simply said to the church, you are the light of the world. And the only reason for the existence of the church is when the church finds its place in the world as providing the light to the world. But there is something more. There is something more. John saw Jesus. He was dressed in the robe, in the priestly robe. And according to chapter 2, verse 1, Jesus was walking among those lampstands. The Jewish writings are telling us clearly that the daily task of a chosen priest in Jerusalem temple was to keep the lamps in the holy place burning brightly. The priest had so many times during the day to enter the holy place, and he would trim and refill the lamps that were waning, but would replace the wick on the lamps that had gone out and refill them with fresh oil and relight them. In the light of this background, Christ was seen by John appearing as a priest performing the daily services by ministering to the churches and helping them in their needs. Jesus has the full knowledge of the spiritual condition and need of each church in the way that the priest had the full knowledge of each of the 7 lamps that were located in the holy place. But in such way, not just the priest, Jesus appears in the full authority and power of God. And he assures John that he is in charge of those congregations. Don't forget, John is on Patmos. He was suffering, but he worried so much of the churches because John was in charge. But Jesus placed his right hand on John, saying, John, stop being afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one, and I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever, and I have the keys of death and Hades. In other words, John, you are not in charge. I am in charge. These churches, they belong to me. So Jesus commissions John to write down the 7 messages and send them to the churches in Asia. And according to the book of Revelation, those messages were to be read by the angels. You remember? To the angel of the church in Arite. By the way, in the light of the symbolism of the book of Revelation, the angels were the different symbolic references to the elders in those churches. They were the ones to receive those messages and to send them to the church. Please keep in mind something. Christ is in charge. The leaders in those churches that are referred to as angels, God's messengers, they are not in charge. They received the message from Christ and they were supposed to read it to the congregation. Christ is the head of the church, not those elders. Christ holds the keys in his hands, not human beings. These reflect his promise to Peter that his church is built on him as the rock. Therefore, the gates of hell will not overcome the church, because that church belongs to Christ. He is the head to that church. Brothers and sisters, we are all familiar with that. That even though those churches existed at the time of John, they at the same time, those churches in Asia Minor, represented the entire Christian church from John's day until the time of the end. The spiritual conditions of those 7 churches corresponded to the spiritual condition of Christianity in different periods of history. The 7 messages that provide, from heaven's perspective, a panoramic survey of history from the 1st century until the time of the end. Thus, the 7 messages equally speak to all Christians at any time and place. And please let me just remind you a few things. Those churches in the time of John, they faced 2 different issues and problems. The first problems were external. Those churches were located in the Roman province of Asia. They were located in a pagan environment, and there are temptations everywhere. But then there were the internal issues and the problems that the church faced. And the internal problems were related to the question how the Christians should relate to the pagan environment, how to behave toward people among whom the Christians live there. So all the problems in Asia Minor of those churches can be defined in different terms. Persecution, struggle with the identity, worldliness, how to relate to the environment, how to relate to the pagan society. It's an activity, it's struggle with identity. How to relate to those issues. I believe as we are talking here about these messages to the 7 churches, They were given at the beginning of the book of Revelation because the book of Revelation does not conclude with chapter 3. The book of Revelation, as we stated at the beginning, defines the Christian church throughout the history, all up to the time of the end. Yeah, the church lives in different periods. God's people face different problems, but always the basic issue is who is in charge, who is in control. And then, as we saw, that the last part of the book of Revelation brings us to the time of the end. So in order that we find out how we as a church should live, how we should take Jesus Christ as our head, how to relate to the people around us, and how to solve different issues and problems that we have in the church, we have to read those 7 messages. Because the same is the devil is the same. The problems that the church is facing today, faced from the very, very beginning of its history. We will always look for a perfect church. And somebody said, if you're not happy with the church that you belong to, and you try to find a perfect church, maybe you'll find one. But the moment you find the perfect church, the church would cease to be perfect because you joined the church. Therefore, instead of looking at people, we should really focus on Christ. Yeah, as in those 7 churches, we today have false teachers. We have different issues. We have struggle with identity. We have a struggle how to relate to the world in which we are, how to relate to the delay of the second coming of Christ. But Jesus' promise to his people is, I will be with you until the very end of the age. My son, my daughter, this church belongs to me. And the gates of hell will never overcome that church. People can betray you. People can fail. But don't forget, I am the head of the church, and I am in charge. And I'm sorry I cannot finish my concluding remarks today, but not to go to the conclusion of the book of Revelation. The book concludes with that description of the glorious, long-awaited union of Christ with his bride, the church, which is portrayed in terms of the Hebrew wedding. In ancient Hebrew wedding, when a young man wanted to get married, he would take his parents and go to that gentleman's house, explaining that he is in love with his daughter. The negotiation would start, and finally, when negotiation is finished, the dowry is paid. There will be celebration. And young man would stand up and say, now I'm going back to my father's house. I'm going to prepare the place where me and my bride will live together. When I prepare a place, I will come back and the wedding will take place. Brothers and sisters, 2,000 years ago, the bridegroom came, and on the cross of Calvary, he paid the dowry. But then he made the promise in Gospel of John chapter 14. There are many places, many rooms in my Father's house. But I'm going to prepare the place for my bride. When I prepare the place, I will come back and I will take you and you will be there where I am. 2,000 years ago, Jesus made a promise to his church. And the conclusion of the book of Revelation is telling us about the way how that promise will be fulfilled and come true. And this is described in the terms of that Hebrew wedding. In chapter 21, with the coming of New Jerusalem, which is portrayed as the bride of the Lamb, God's church, God's people, finally will find their home. Why? Because this church does not belong to human beings. It belongs to Christ. He started it, and he will finish that work. And that's why his promise is still valid. I will be with you always until the very end of the age. Amen.